Welcome to Crisis in Perception, where we examine the systems shaping our world.
And today we're really taking the red pill on this one. We're looking at the machinery of belief itself.
Yeah, we are.
We're going to deconstruct the institutions that literally taught you how to think. You know, the media that tells you what to see, and the economic structures that define the boundaries of your world.
It's a massive topic. Today's deep dive is centered on Chomsky, on Miseducation by Noam Chomsky, edited by Donaldo Macedo. And I have to be honest, when I first grabbed this source material, I assumed we'd be talking about, bad teachers,
Right.
or why standardized testing is annoying, or pedagogy techniques. But that is not what this is.
No, not at all. If you're coming into this deep dive expecting a guide on how to write a better lesson plan, you're going to be very confused.
Yeah.
This is a strict systems-level institutional analysis. We aren't looking at bugs in the software. We're looking at the operating system itself.
And the central argument presented here is just jarring, because we are all raised with this sort of brochure idea of what school is.
The brochure, right?
Yeah, the brochure says school is a democratic site. It's where you go to become an independent thinker, a critical citizen. It is the great equalizer.
It's a lovely story. But the source material argues that if you look at the actual design of the system, not what it claims to do, but what it structurally does, it's the exact opposite.
Completely the opposite.
Chomsky and Macedo argue the educational system is designed for, well, stupidification. It's an instrument for indoctrination and the imposition of obedience.
Stupidification. That is such a specific and aggressive word.
It
It sounds like an insult, or like something a rebellious teenager would yell, school's making me stupid. But Macedo uses it as a highly technical term.
He does. And we need to be really careful with definitions here.
Mm.
He doesn't mean making people unintelligent. He doesn't mean the system wants people who can't do math or can't read a manual.
Because the system obviously needs capable people.
Exactly. The system needs very smart, very capable technicians to keep the lights on.
No, they want smart workers, but what?
They want smart workers who are politically stupid. Stupidification in this structural context means dulling the critical faculty. It means severing the link between the student and the actual social reality they live in.
Training people to be efficient gears in a machine.
Right, without ever asking what the machine is actually building or who's driving it.
So the mission for this deep dive is to trace that architecture. We need to understand how this actually works, because on the surface, it sounds like a massive conspiracy theory. The schools are brainwashing us. It feels a bit tinfoil hat.
It absolutely does if you view it as a conspiracy, like a bunch of guys in a dark, smoky room planning the curriculum. But Chomsky is very explicit. This isn't a conspiracy. It is an institutional design.
It's just how the system operates.
It's about incentives. So we're going to map this out. We'll look at the design of these institutions, the incentives that mold the people inside them, the outcomes, which usually show up as a strange kind of historical amnesia, and finally, the interconnection.
Right, how schools, media, and corporate power all link up.
Exactly.
Let's start with the design layer, because if you want to understand what schools are for, you have to understand who they serve. And Chomsky starts with a definition of democracy that is, well, it's definitely not the one I learned in 7th grade civics.
No, it's not. In civics class, you learn that democracy is ruled by the people. We vote, we decide, the government executes our will.
The classic model.
But Chomsky argues that in the United States, democracy structurally refers to a system of elite decision and public ratification.
Elite decision and public ratification. That sounds like we were just signing a permission slip for decisions that have already been made.
That is exactly what it is.
Yeah.
In this system, the public is viewed as a spectator. We watch the game, we cheer. Maybe every 4 years we get to choose which team captain stands on the podium.
But we are never allowed on the field to call the plays.
Never. And this isn't just Chomsky giving his opinion. To see this in action, we have to look at the Trilateral Commission.
Okay, I've heard of the Trilateral Commission, usually in the context of, internet rabbit holes. But what was it, actually, in historical terms?
It was and still is a very real public organization established in the early 1970s. It represented the liberal internationalist elite.
Okay.
We're talking about people like Jimmy Carter, major corporate CEOs, top academics from Europe, Japan, North America. This was the brain trust of the Western world.
The establishment.
Yes. And in 1975, they released a very significant report called The Crisis of Democracy.
1975. So this is right on the heels of the 60s.
Precisely. And that context is vital for you to keep in mind. Think about the 60s. You had the civil rights movement, the anti-war movement, the feminist movement, the environmental movement. For most of us looking back, that looks like a society finally waking up. It looks like democracy actually working. People participating.
They were actively demanding their rights. They were on the field calling plays.
But how did the Trilateral Commission, again, these are liberal elites, not right-wing reactionaries.
Yeah.
How did they view that upheaval?
They probably didn't love it.
They didn't call it a flowering of democracy. They called it a crisis.
Yeah.
They explicitly argued in this report that the system was suffering from an excess of democracy.
An excess. That implies that there's a correct amount of democracy, and it's a lot less than what the public was demanding in the 60s.
That's the core of it. The report argued that previously marginalized groups, women, young people, minorities, were pressing their demands too forcefully on the state.
They were asking for too much.
They said the system had become overloaded. The special interests, which is just their term for the general population, were taking over. And here is the absolute kicker for our deep dive today.
What's that?
They pinpointed the institutions responsible for, quote, the indoctrination of the young, unquote, as the point of failure.
Wait, they actually used that exact phrase, indoctrination of the young.
That is their phrase in the report, not Chomsky's. They felt that schools, universities, and churches were failing in their duty to indoctrinate the young into the proper passivity.
Wow.
They believed the schools had become too permissive. They were producing too many dissidents. So the proposed solution to this crisis was to restore discipline, to make the educational system a more effective filter for obedience.
So when we analyze the design of modern education, we have to view it through that specific structural lens. It's a calculated response to the danger of too much public participation.
Correct. And to understand how that filter functions, we have to examine the class structure Chomsky outlines. He borrows a framework from Walter Lippmann and Edward Bernays, who are essentially the fathers of modern public relations.
Right. They divided society into two main groups, the specialized class and the bewildered herd.
Yes. The specialized class makes up roughly 20% of the population. These are the people who analyze, execute, make decisions, and manage the empire.
The managers.
They are the cultural managers, the journalists, the politicians, the academics. They are the natural rulers in the eyes of the elite.
And then you have everyone else.
The bewildered herd. That's the other 80%. Their structural function is simply to be spectators.
To stay out of the way.
To be distracted.
Yeah.
To care about consumption, sports, celebrity gossip, and what Chomsky calls anti-politics.
Anti-politics, meaning what exactly?
Basically, a generalized hatred of the government without actually understanding who controls the government or how power works. Just a vague, cynical disengagement.
So the education system acts as a sorting hat. It decides who gets tracked into the specialized class and who gets relegated to the bewildered herd.
It is entirely a filter.
Yeah.
And this is where Chomsky provides this brilliant concrete comparison between Harvard and MIT.
I found this part of the source material so fascinating. Because usually we think of the Ivy League, Harvard, Yale as the ultimate pinnacle of open-minded, liberal education. And we think of engineering schools as rigid and formulaic. But Chomsky completely flips that assumption.
He does. He says Harvard is the primary training ground for the specialized class, the rulers. Because these students are going to be managing ideology and power, their education is heavily skewed toward ideological control.
Right.
At Harvard, you don't just learn facts. You learn socialization.
You learn how to dress. You learn how to behave at cocktail parties.
You learn the boundaries of acceptable thought. You learn what questions not to ask if you want to be invited back to the table. It's a finishing school for the managers of the state.
And if you stray outside those lines?
If you are too radical at Harvard, you are a problem. You won't get the recommendations, you won't get the corporate connections you need to rise to power, you get filtered out.
Okay, but why is MIT structurally different in this analysis?
Because MIT trains the technicians. They are building bridges, designing circuits, creating missile guidance systems. The system actually needs those things to function in the real world.
Right, the stakes are physical.
You cannot ideologically fudge a physics equation. If you do, the bridge collapses. The missile misses.
Gravity doesn't care about your political ideology.
Exactly. So Chomsky noted that at MIT, there was structurally more room for political dissent. The administration didn't care quite as much what the students thought about foreign policy as long as their math was correct.
Interesting.
You could be a radical anti-war activist on the weekend, as long as you built a working radar system on Monday.
So the closer you are to actual power, to the levers of ideological control, the tighter the leash becomes.
That is the core design principle. The system allows freedom where it doesn't threaten power, like in purely technical fields, or for the bewildered herd who have no leverage anyway. But it imposes strict conformity on the people who will actually be managing the society.
Which perfectly transitions us into the incentives layer. Because
Yeah.
I know a lot of people listening are probably thinking, look, I know teachers, I know journalists.
Sure.
They aren't robots. They aren't sitting in staff meetings plotting how to brainwash people.
And that is a very fair point. This analysis is not about individual malice. Most teachers are deeply well-meaning. Most journalists genuinely want to report the truth. But we have to look at the institutional pressures they operate under.
The structural incentive.
Right. Chomsky argues that in a theoretically free society, you can't control people with overt force. You can't put a soldier with a rifle in every newsroom or every classroom.
So you have to put the cop in their head.
Auto-censorship.
Yeah.
Think about the career trajectory of a successful academic or a journalist. How do you actually get ahead in those fields?
You get good grades, you get strong recommendations, you get hired by a prestigious institution, and then you get promoted.
And what behaviors are required to get those things? You get them by pleasing the people above you in the hierarchy. You get them by conforming to what Chomsky calls the code of the profession.
Right.
He refers to these professionals as cultural middle managers or commissars. Their structural job is to propagate the theological truths of the state.
Theological truths, like the myth that the free market is the only viable system or that American foreign policy is always fundamentally about defense and democracy.
Exactly. Now, imagine a young journalist. Let's call him Alex. Alex is bright, he's ambitious, and he's highly skeptical. He lands a job at a major, respectable newspaper.
Okay.
He starts writing investigative pieces that fundamentally question the motives of U.S. foreign policy. Not just saying, oh, we made a tactical error, but saying, we are the aggressors here. What happens to Alex?
His editor pulls him aside, says, Alex, this is a bit unbalanced. You're sounding a bit radical. We need you to be objective.
And in this system, objective is simply a structural code word for aligning with the official state narrative.
Right.
If Alex keeps pushing those boundaries, he stops getting the big assignments. He doesn't get the promotion to the national desk. Maybe his contract isn't renewed. He is quietly weeded out.
The filter working exactly as designed.
Meanwhile, his colleague, let's call her Sarah, writes stories that perfectly fit the narrative. She questions the tactics of a war, sure, but never the underlying motives.
She plays the game.
She is praised as nuanced and responsible. She gets the promotion. Eventually, she becomes the editor-in-chief.
So by the time Sarah's running the paper, she doesn't need to be consciously censored by anyone. She has spent 20 years internalizing the rules of the system. She fully believes them.
She has censored herself to survive and thrive. And this leads to a massive paradox that Chomsky highlights, which is central to this deep dive. The more educated you are, the more indoctrinated you are likely to be.
That is such a counterintuitive idea for most of us. We always say education is the cure for ignorance. Education liberates. But this analysis says education is the primary mechanism of indoctrination.
Think about the time investment. To be highly educated means you have spent decades inside these filtering institutions. You have been subjected to the reward and punishment system for much longer than someone who dropped out at 16.
You've been conditioned.
And you have vastly more to lose. A carpenter who fundamentally disagrees with the government doesn't lose his job because he hangs drywall. But a tenured professor who challenges the fundamental myths of their department, they might lose their status, their grant funding, their access to the media.
The carpenter hasn't been socialized in the same way. He deals with physical reality, wood and nails. The professor deals with ideas and peer approval.
Exactly. The carpenter is closer to material reality. The professor is closer to state ideology, which brings us perfectly to the outcomes of this system.
If the design is a filter and the incentive is conformity, what does the product actually look like?
The product is what Macedo calls stupidification. And the source material provides a perfect, genuinely heartbreaking case study for this. The story of David Spritzler.
Yes, this story really encapsulates the whole dynamic. David Spritzler was a 12-year-old student at Boston Latin School. And for context, Boston Latin is a highly prestigious public school. It's a major feeder school into Harvard.
It's prime pipeline for the specialized class.
Right. And this incident happened around the time of the Gulf War. David decided he was not going to recite the Pledge of Allegiance in class.
A 12-year-old refusenik.
And his reasoning was incredible. He didn't just cross his arms and say, I don't want to do it. He told them the pledge was a hypocritical exhortation to patriotism.
At 12.
At 12.
Right.
He pointed to the phrase, with liberty and justice for all. And he said simply, that is a lie. There isn't liberty and justice for all. Look at the poor. Look at the systemic discrimination in the country. So I won't say it.
And structurally, that is a factual statement. You can argue about aspirations all day long, but as an empirical description of current social reality, he was entirely correct.
He was just observing the world as it actually is. But what was the school's reaction? Did these highly educated, specialized teachers sit down and say, wow, David, that's a deep analytical thought. Let's have a Socratic dialogue about the gap between our national ideals and our material reality?
They absolutely did not. They tried to punish him. They tried to force him to conform.
Why? Why is a 12-year-old kid's silence so deeply threatening to a room full of educated adults?
Because the institutional system requires domestication. The teachers structurally prioritize obedience over truth. Chomsky argues that the teachers literally could not perceive what the child was seeing. They had been stupidified by their own education.
They were incapable of reading the world.
Yes. Mesido uses that exact framework, reading the world versus reading the word. The teachers could read the textbook. They could strictly follow the bureaucratic procedure, but they were unable to read the actual social reality directly in front of their faces.
So they pathologized him.
They relied on what Macedo calls psychobabble. They treated David's accurate structural observation as a behavioral problem to be managed, rather than treating him as a citizen with a valid analytical point.
It's essentially institutional gaslighting. The kid sees the undeniable truth, and the authorities tell him he's crazy or deviant for pointing it out.
And that is the predictable outcome of the system. It reliably produces adults who are completely unable to see the obvious if the obvious contradicts the official state myth.
And this scales up, right? This brings us to the broader concept of historical engineering. It's not just about one kid and the pledge. It's about how the entire population is taught its own history.
A pedagogy of lies. We are systematically taught the founding myths of the state. And the core myth in the U.S. system is global meliorism.
Which is a very academic term for what exactly?
It's the default, unquestionable assumption that everything the United States does internationally is fundamentally driven by a desire to make the world better.
The benevolence assumption.
Right. Even if we invade a sovereign country, even if we bomb a civilian center, the institutional assumption is that we are doing it to save them or to spread freedom. We are always the city on a hill.
But the source material details some brutal historical counterexamples that are very conveniently entirely omitted from the standard curriculum.
There's a highly specific example Chomsky uses regarding the history of Massachusetts. Now, we all learn the standard curriculum about the Pilgrims, the Mayflower, the first Thanksgiving. It's a nice, peaceful story of cooperation.
Right.
But Chomsky cites the actual colonial records. The Massachusetts legislature once passed a formal law providing monetary rewards for Native American scalps.
Actual state bounties on human heads.
40 pounds for a male scalp, 20 pounds for a female scalp, or a child under 12. This was legally codified state-sponsored genocide. It wasn't a rogue operation. It was the law.
I can guarantee you I did not see that in my 5th grade history textbook.
Of course you didn't. Because structurally, you cannot hold the concept of global meliorism and the reality of child scalp bounties in your head at the same time. Cognitive dissonance won't allow it.
One of them has to be erased.
And the school system ensures it's the scalp bounties that disappear down the memory hole. History is systematically engineered to protect the image of the state's inherent benevolence.
And this historical engineering isn't just about the colonial era. The text digs into the Vietnam syndrome as a modern post-war example of this exact same mechanism.
This part of the analysis is critical. After the Vietnam War, the American public was deeply disillusioned. They saw the war for what it empirically was: a massive disaster, a staggering moral crime.
They were sick of the violence.
They didn't want the state intervening abroad anymore. And the elites, the specialized class, viewed this public reluctance and labeled it the Vietnam syndrome, like it was a psychological disease.
They viewed the public's completely rational desire for peace as a sickness that needed to be cured.
Exactly. So the system had to reprogram the population. They had to systematically shift the historical frame from the war was a crime to the war was a mistake.
Now, to a lot of people, that might seem like a semantic distinction. Mistake versus crime. Why is that shift so crucial?
It changes everything about the moral architecture. A mistake implies fundamentally good intentions. It says, we tried to save them from communism, but we were clumsy, we didn't understand the culture, we got bogged down.
Oops.
Right. But a crime implies we had no legal or moral right to be there in the first place. It implies we were the imperial aggressors. So the entire educational and media apparatus spent the 1980s relentlessly shifting that frame to mistake.
And you see the institutional result in how our leaders speak. The text mentions George H.W. Bush making a massive Freudian slip about this.
Yes, regarding the Gulf War in the early 90s, he was giving an address, and he accidentally said, quote, "We did fulfill our aggression," unquote, instead of "we did fulfill our mission."
Wow.
And Dan Quayle, his vice president, called the war a stirring victory for the forces of aggression.
They accidentally told the structural truth.
Because deeply embedded in the institutional reality, the state is aggressive. It's an empire. But the conscious narrative, the one they are required to maintain, is strictly one of defense. The educational system is designed to ensure that by the time you reach adulthood, you automatically view American aggression as defense and any indigenous resistance to it as terrorism.
So this brings us to the persistence of the system, because eventually the student leaves the classroom, they graduate. So why does this engineered worldview stick? Why doesn't reality shatter it once they enter the workforce?
Because the school is just the primary socialization stage. The media institutions and the economic structures immediately take over where the school leaves off. They function as a unified, seamless feedback loop.
Let's transition to the media component of that loop. We just outlined historical engineering in textbooks. But Chomsky argues the daily news apparatus does the exact same thing in real time.
He uses a massive case study of Central America in the 1980s to prove this. He introduces the concept of symmetry. It's a brilliant structural example of how media can manufacture reality without technically printing a false word.
Just by manipulating where they point the camera?
Exactly. Selection bias as a weapon.
So, set the historical scene for us in Central America.
It's the 1980s. You have massive, violent conflicts in Nicaragua, El Salvador, and Guatemala. In Nicaragua, the U.S. State Department fiercely hates the government, the Sandinistas.
Right.
In El Salvador and Guatemala, the U.S. actively funds and supports the regimes.
And the regimes we supported in El Salvador and Guatemala were incredibly brutal.
We are talking about state death squads, massacres of unarmed peasants, Catholic priests being assassinated, horrific, undeniable human rights abuses.
Right.
But the U.S. media needed to justify American intervention against Nicaragua. So structurally, they created a false symmetry. They heavily demonized the Sandinistas while systematically ignoring the atrocities of the U.S.-backed regimes right next door.
But how does a major newspaper ignore a massacre?
You literally just don't assign a reporter to cover it. Or you bury it. The text cites a comprehensive study by the Media Alliance. They analyzed the New York Times coverage of the region. They found that the Times devoted 10 times more coverage to Nicaragua than to El Salvador and Guatemala combined.
10 times the volume of ink.
And the framing was entirely different. When the Sandinistas in Nicaragua temporarily censored a newspaper, it was massive front-page news. Tyranny in Nicaragua, freedom of the press destroyed.
Right.
But when the U.S.-backed regime in El Salvador literally murdered the editor of a newspaper, it was buried on page 20, or just completely omitted.
So the average reader, a member of the bewildered herd, sits at their breakfast table, reads the paper, and logically concludes, wow, Nicaragua is a totalitarian hellhole, we have to intervene. And they think El Salvador is fine.
They think El Salvador is a developing nation struggling toward democracy. They don't see the blood on the ground because the institutional camera refuses to point at it. That is how you manufacture consent. It's not about fabricating events, it's about structural selection bias.
And this systemic manipulation isn't just limited to foreign policy. It extends directly into the domestic economy. We are all taught to believe in market democracy. That is the fundamental religion of the West. But this deep dive argues that market democracy is perhaps the biggest engineered myth of all.
The free market. We hear it invoked every single day as a law of nature. But Chomsky argues that structurally, what we actually have is a dual system. We have brutal free market capitalism for the poor and state socialism for the rich.
Break that down analytically. How does that duality work?
Look at the Lockheed example in the text. Lockheed, which is now Lockheed Martin, is a massive private corporation. They generate private profits. Their executives make millions. But structurally, where does their revenue actually come from?
Government defense contracts. The taxpayer.
Exactly. And what happens when they face financial collapse? At one point in the 70s, Lockheed was facing bankruptcy. Did the so-called free market step in and let them fail, as the theory dictates?
No, the government stepped in with massive loan guarantees, a taxpayer bailout.
Right. So the public pays the cost of research and development through the Pentagon. The public absorbs the risk of failure through bailouts. But the profits remain entirely private.
Privatize the gains, socialize the losses.
Chomsky calls the defense industrial base a structural cover for the massive public subsidy of high-tech industry. Computers, the internet, commercial aviation, satellite technology, almost all of the core economy was developed with massive public funding under the guise of defense, and then handed over to private corporations to exploit for profit.
So neoliberalism, or market democracy, is really just a system where the state aggressively protects elite power from the risks of the market,
While simultaneously using the harsh reality of the market to discipline the working class. If a single mother runs out of money, the system tells her to pull herself up by her bootstraps.
She faces the wrath of market forces.
But if a major bank or a defense contractor mismanages their funds, the state instantly opens the public checkbook to save them.
And this structural hypocrisy is permanently locked in by international agreements like NAFTA.
This is a crucial analytical point about the hollowing out of democracy. We are taught to think of NAFTA merely as a trade deal about lowering tariffs on goods. But Chomsky argues its primary structural purpose was to lock Mexico in.
Lock them into what, specifically?
To neoliberal economic reforms. The institutional goal was to bind the Mexican economy to U.S. corporate interests via an international treaty.
Why use a treaty?
So that even if the Mexican population had a democratic revolution, even if they explicitly voted for a socialist or populist government, that new government couldn't legally change the economic policy.
Because it would violate the international treaty and they'd be sanctioned.
Exactly. It structurally insulates fundamental economic policy from the voters. You can vote for the red party, you can vote for the blue party, but neither of them can alter the core distribution of wealth and power, because it's locked in above the democratic level. That is how you restrict the parameters of allowable thought.
Which brings us perfectly to the final major piece of this puzzle, the interconnection. We've traced schools filtering the students. We've traced media filtering the narrative. We've traced the economy insulating the power. It is all one massive, unified feedback loop.
It's standing directly at the center of that loop is the shadow of big business. This brings us to a really profound quote from John Dewey. Now, Dewey was a pragmatist philosopher. He's widely considered a hero of mainstream American education.
Right.
But he made an incredibly radical structural observation. He said, politics is the shadow cast on society by big business.
Politics is the shadow cast on society by big business. That is a very poetic way of stating a very dark reality.
He went further. He added that the attenuation of the shadow will not change the substance. Meaning, you cannot fix systemic corruption simply by passing campaign finance reform or tweaking the voting rules.
You're just playing with the shadow.
Right. As long as private corporate power, the substance remains massively concentrated and unaccountable, it will continually cast that shadow over the political sphere.
And Chomsky takes Dewey's observation a step further. He analyzes the internal structure of corporations themselves, and he uses the T word.
Totalitarian.
That sounds extremely hyperbolic to a lot of people. When we think of totalitarianism, we think of Stalin or Hitler. We think of secret police.
But strip away the historical aesthetics and look at the actual structural design of a modern corporation. It is a strict top-down hierarchy.
Okay.
Orders emanate entirely from the top scale. The board of directors, the CEO, those orders flow down. The workers at the bottom have absolutely zero democratic say in the decision-making process.
They can't vote on what the company produces.
They can be fired at will. Their speech is strictly controlled while on the clock. Their physical movements and time are monitored and controlled. Structurally, it is a private tyranny.
And the average person spends the vast majority of their waking adult life inside these specific totalitarian institutions.
We do. And these private tyrannies haven't just stayed in the economic sphere. They have completely colonized the public sphere. They own the consolidated media networks. They fund the university endowments. They systematically lobby the government.
So let's map the full loop here. The educational system produces the specialized class, the managers who have internalized the elite rules.
Yes.
The specialized class then manages the media institutions and the state bureaucracy. The media and the state bureaucracy function to protect corporate interests and manufacture consent among the bewildered herd.
Exactly.
And then those very corporate interests dictate the funding, the testing standards, and the curricula of the educational system, starting the cycle all over again.
It is a perfectly closed loop, and the psychological result of this loop is anti-politics. The bewildered herd is actively conditioned to direct all their anger and frustration at the government.
Because the government, the shadow is visible to us. We
Yeah.
see the politicians arguing on C-SPAN. We experience the inefficiency of the DMV.
But we don't see the unaccountable corporate boardrooms pulling the strings behind the curtain, because the corporation is legally treated as a private entity. It is structurally off-limits to public debate.
Right.
So we channel all of our democratic energy into hating the public sector, which is the one single place where we technically still have a mechanism to vote, and we leave the massive private power structures completely untouched and invisible.
That is the ultimate institutional magic trick, getting the public to dismantle their own democratic leverage.
Exactly.
So we have mapped the entire system. We've got the design, the incentives, the outcomes, and the structural loop, which means we are at the pivot point of this deep dive. I have to ask the core question. What is the crisis in perception here?
We need to break that down analytically, because typically, when we look at our institutions, we look at the surface. We see test scores dropping or kids acting out, and we perceive that the education system is failing.
We see clickbait or bias on the news, and we say journalism is failing.
Right. But the crisis in perception is that we are looking at the entire machine upside down. We are misperceiving the function of the system. If you look at the structural design as explicitly laid out by groups like the Trilateral Commission, the system isn't failing at all. It is wildly succeeding.
It's succeeding.
If the institutional goal is the indoctrination of the young, if the goal is stupidification, dulling the critical faculty so people can't read the world, if the goal is to produce a passive, divided, bewildered herd and a highly obedient, self-censoring specialized class,
then the system is working perfectly.
it is producing exactly the outcomes it was structurally designed to produce.
So when well-meaning politicians try to fix education by imposing more standardized testing or demanding more patriotic history curricula, they aren't fixing a broken machine. They're just greasing the gears of the very machine that is crushing critical thought.
Precisely. We are fundamentally mistaking the core feature for a bug. And the second critical layer of this crisis in perception involves how we view the educated class.
The experts.
Yes. We see a panelist on television with a PhD from Harvard or a senior columnist for a major paper of record, and we instinctively perceive them as neutral, objective arbiters of truth.
Because they have the credentials.
But systems-level analysis reveals that structurally, they're the most deeply indoctrinated people in the room. They're the individuals who successfully navigated the institutional filter without triggering the alarms.
We are trusting the high priesthood of the doctrinal system to explain to us how the religion works.
Which ensures we will never see the bars of the cage. And finally, the ultimate crisis in perception is that we perceive market democracy as the definition of human freedom, when structurally, it is a sophisticated mechanism designed to insulate elite power from democratic accountability.
We continuously mistake the shadow for the substance.
We do. And recognizing that distinction is the only way to change visibility.
This analysis fundamentally alters how you watch the evening news. It changes how you reflect on your own years in school. It makes you realize that being praised as a good student might just mean you are highly susceptible to domestication.
It's a very sobering realization. But the source material doesn't leave us completely without hope. Toward the end of the text, Chomsky references Dewey again, and also Bertrand Russell, to offer a genuinely different vision of what education could structurally be.
What does that alternative model look like?
They argued that the fundamental goal of an educational system should not be to produce an efficient worker for a corporation or an obedient citizen for a state empire. The goal should be to produce a free human being. Russell had this beautiful analogy. He said, we should regard a child's mind as a gardener regards a young tree.
Not as an empty bucket waiting to be filled with state myths.
No. You provide the nutrient-rich soil, you ensure it has light, you provide the air, and then you step back and let the tree organically grow into its own unique shape.
You give them the tools to read the world for themselves.
Exactly. You actively encourage them to rigorously question authority, including your own authority as the teacher in the classroom.
But structurally, that sounds incredibly dangerous to the current system.
It is an existential threat to the system. True education reliably produces dissidents. It produces independent thinkers who cause friction. It produces people exactly like David Spritzler.
The 12-year-old who simply looked at the world, saw the truth, and refused to pledge his obedience to a lie.
The ultimate challenge for all of us as we process this analysis is to recognize how deeply we have been conditioned to view uncritical obedience as a civic virtue. The crisis is that we constantly mistake the domesticated, compliant worker for the good citizen.
But sometimes, the truly good citizen is the one who refuses to stand up.
Crisis in Perception examines how systems shape belief and how better tools help us see clearly.
This project is free and publicly accessible. If you'd like to support the time, tools, and research behind Crisis in Perception, you can become a supporter on Patreon.
For a shorter visual overview of this topic, see the mini explainer linked in the description.
If you enjoyed this kind of systems-level analysis, please like, subscribe, and comment with books or topics you'd like us to explore next.